Good evening. Yes, I am. Ryan, are we streaming? Are we on? Okay. All right. Again, good evening. Yes, I am missing someone. Vicky is not able to be here tonight, but she will be here for the rest of the sessions. So she's fine. Everything's fine. She just wasn't able to join us tonight. But I'm here, and you're here, and we're going to start this study off together with two videos tonight with Rob Fuqua. And I don't know, how many people have heard of Rob Fuqua before? I know, when we say Adam Hamilton or Andy Stanley, you're like, oh yeah, I know who that is. Rob Fuqua. Rob Fuqua is a United Methodist pastor and author. He is married to the daughter of one of our United Methodist bishops, Bishop Wilkie's daughter. And originally, Rob is from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, but he currently is serving as senior pastor at St. Luke's United Methodist in Indianapolis. And it's funny because St. Luke's in Indianapolis is one of the largest United Methodist churches in the country. But you always hear so much about Church of the Resurrection and Adam Hamilton. I'm always curious, like, how come we don't hear more about St. Luke's? Because it's a mega church, too. I mean, if you ever get to look it up and see pictures, it's a huge place. But anyway, he is serving as senior pastor there. He's written some other studies, and the first study I ever did that was a Rob Fuqua study was called Take the Flag. And I used this for a Lenten study in a congregation where I knew that there was no way that anyone in that congregation was a race fan. I just knew that. You know your congregation and you know what their interests are. And this study called Take the Flag took all of the flags used in racing and applied them. Each week was a different colored flag and how it applied in racing, and they'd have interviews in the video with NASCAR drivers and Indy drivers, and then he would take that flag and apply it to our walk with Christ. And I thought it was just so different than the average Lenten study that you've seen so many times, and so we used it, even knowing that there were no race fans, but we all enjoyed it. It was just funny how you learned a little something about all the flags, you learned a little bit something about racing, but also just how he managed to apply those flags to our walk with Christ was really interesting. This study is also very interesting because, again, we're used to so many Lenten studies out there that sort of follow this one kind of cookie-cutter pattern, and this one does not do that. This one, Which Way, Lord? Exploring Your Life's Purpose in the Journeys of Paul. And it's just a fascinating way for us in this season of Lent when we talk about this being a time for us to re-examine our walk with Christ and to sort of take stock of that faith journey and see, is there something we're missing? Or have we wandered off the path perhaps, and we need to refocus our calling? And so this study looks to do that, to look at your life's purpose as you're doing this sort of introspection that we are called to do during Lent. And so he talks about that in terms of the journeys of Paul and how Paul kind of went through this process, of not only a call by God, but also then finding his purpose and how that can apply to us. So it's very interesting. And so tonight we're going to do two video segments because the first one really is just more of an intro, and it just kind of kicks things off and gets us going. And so I felt that we could do more than just that. And so we're going to combine these two. And the first section is called Preparing for Purpose. And before we get into that first clip, that first video, which we'll watch, it's about 14 minutes. We'll watch that, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion, and then we'll watch the second video, which is about 12 minutes, and then we can just have as much discussion as we want after that one. But to sort of just get us kicked off in this direction, in the leader guide, Rob shares a story from our more recent American history, and he talks about the son of President Kennedy, John Kennedy Jr., John, and how in July of 1999, you remember this from the news, I'm sure, how John Jr., who had recently become a pilot, he, his wife, and his sister-in-law boarded a small plane. They were flying up the coast. He talks about in detail, after having interviews with the flight instructor that taught John Jr., Rob Fuqua had some interviews and some conversations, and the flight instructor shared some things with him. And he says that the three of them boarded the plane on July 16th, 1999, in a private plane in New Jersey. Kennedy in the pilot's seat, uncertified to fly only with instruments, and he had less than an hour of experience flying at night without an instructor, less than an hour. And yet he refused his instructor's offer to ride along with him because, in his words, he wanted to do it alone. And once in the air, and these are some of the parts that we remember from the news, things that we learned. But as you may remember, once he got in the air, there was a haze. You remember that obstructed Kennedy's view of the horizon, and he became very disoriented. And you know, it's if you've ever come down driving in a car, if you've ever come down a hill, and you know the clouds can be a certain way, and you would swear that you're looking at a coastline, even though you may not be anywhere near water. But just the way the light and the clouds and a certain time of day can really fool you. And so in the air, it's of course much more dangerous and much worse. And he became very disoriented to the point that he wasn't even able to tell if he had the plane level or if he was, you know, going up or down. And of course, we know he was in a spiral downward spin, and of course the plane crashed and all three were killed. But Rob says in the Leader's Guide, he said Kennedy's desire to do it alone, despite his lack of training, despite his experience, really, of course, had horrific consequences. But this is a very human condition that many of us experience, that feeling of, I need to do it myself. I want to do it alone. And sometimes we throw out whether or not we're experienced enough to do whatever it is, or whether we've had enough training. But we can understand this impulse, because it is something that many of us experience, many of us feel from time to time in our lives. I'll do it myself. I can do this. You know, I have no training in this, but I can do this. I know I can. And he talks about how what fuels that and makes it even worse is that we live in a society that rewards individualism and independence and sort of pushes us even further in that direction of being more independent and showing our individualism. It becomes especially powerful when we are seeking to find our purpose in life, this desire, this urge to do it alone. Rob talks about in his intro. He says it just becomes very much more powerful when we're seeking to find our purpose. I can do it. I can do this. You know, self-made man, self-made woman. You know, I've done harder things than this, and I can figure this out. And so he kind of, this is sort of to preface the fact that we need help in finding purpose. You know, when you're learning to fly a plane, of course you need experience, you need instruction, and the same he talks about is true in finding our life purpose, that we can't do everything alone. We can't do it all by ourselves, and that especially when we are talking about something as important and also something that can be so difficult to discern on our own, like finding our life's purpose, that we certainly can't do that alone. In fact, he says God created us to be in relationship with God. And so part of that means allowing God to help us in finding our purpose. We are wired, Rob's words, we are wired to live a meaningful existence, but we can't begin to discover what that purpose is unless we know the one who created us for a purpose. So we're going to begin our study. We're going to begin this journey with this very straightforward proposition, and that is to say we don't know ourselves completely. We may know ourselves very well, and we think, hey, you know what? No one knows me as well as I do. But with that said, we don't know ourselves completely. We need help from time to time to figure that out, or from time to time to sort of correct our course in life and to refocus that purpose. As author Max Lucado says, you cannot be anything you want to be. You cannot be anything you want to be, but you can be everything God wants you to be. Another illustration, last illustration, and then we're going to start the video that Rob uses is talking about GPS. You remember, he says, what in the world did we do before we had GPS technology? He says, I don't know how I ever found my way to the hospitals in other towns or made my way to members' homes. And that resonated with me because I remember 32 years ago as a young pastor going to make visits. And you didn't have GPS, we didn't have smartphones. What we had was you would go to 7-Eleven and you would get those map books. Do you remember those things? And for your area, for your region. And so you go to 7-Eleven, you get the Hampton Roads South Side map book, and then you'd have a little sheet of paper with the person's address you were going to go see, because the map book always lived in the little pocket behind the passenger seat of the car. And get in the car and go to the back, and you'd look up that address, in the index, and they would tell you the map coordinate, and then you'd find it, and even then, it wasn't always perfect. You thought you knew exactly where you were going, and, it was very helpful. I mean, it helped me navigate a lot of areas that I was unfamiliar with, but it still wasn't perfect because you still had to rely on you to understand that map and be able to get from point A to point B. But just look how far we've come since those days, since, maps and map books. And then we had MapQuest. You could go on the computer and punch in a thing and print out MapQuest directions, or get the triptych from AAA, right? And then finally, some cars, if you had a fancy car, it would have a navigation system, and you type the address in there, and then the Garmin units came out. Garmin and another company, TomTom. Garmin and TomTom had those little units, and you could stick those on your dash. And then finally, of course, now we have if you have a smartphone, then you have a GPS built in, and you don't have to even type. You can just talk to it and say, take me to wherever. It's really amazing how far we've come. But, even with GPS, and even as good as GPS units are in our smartphones, they're not always 100% accurate. I mean, they, on occasion, and part of it is our error, right? If we don't follow, because sometimes we know better than the GPS, and we don't make the turn, or the GPS doesn't tell us to make the turn in time, and then we hear, make a U-turn. Rerouting. And sometimes the GPS might have the fastest way, but we're doing this in the process when we could just make a straight line and get there 30 seconds later, which I would rather do than do all this zigzagging. So it's not always perfect. But like Rob uses this illustration of the GPS, and then he says, it's not totally accurate. And so instead, when we're talking about our life's purpose, we have to look at the truly perfect GPS, which is not global positioning system, but God's positioning system for our life. As Proverbs 3:5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understanding. So what does it look like to access divine direction? What does it look like if we follow God's positioning system as the GPS for our lives and setting us on that path for finding our life purpose? So with that, we're going to jump into the first session and see what Rob has to say about that.
What is the meaning of my life?
How can I discern God's plans for me?
How should I respond when confronted with obstacles?
By studying the life of the Apostle Paul, we'll learn what it means to be created for a purpose, to be equipped to live a life of significance, despite the adversity and detours we encounter along the way.
Hello, my name is Rob Fuqua, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to this study that will change the direction of your life. I know that's a big statement, but in this journey we're going to be asking a big question, a question every person asks. What is the purpose of my life? I will not be your guide in this journey. I'll be more like your facilitator. Our guide will be the Apostle Paul, the great missionary leader of the first century, who traveled more than 10,000 miles spreading the good news of Jesus Christ and starting churches all over the Mediterranean world. Paul experienced a significant change in the direction of his life the day he met the risen Lord. In this study, we will walk where the Apostle Paul walked, and we'll think about the difference his life made. But more important than that, we will learn from his life and think about the difference God wants to make in each of our lives today. I'm here in Meteora in central Greece, where the hanging monasteries are located. Monasteries built over 600 years ago. Every morning, starting at about 4 a.m., monks wake up and begin the day praying and worshiping. This is a place of great time for spiritual reflection and prayer, and a very appropriate place to introduce this journey. So with your spiritual compass in hand and your life map ready to go, let's get started. We begin our journey here on a road. Like any road, it comes from one place and it goes to another. All of us are on a road of some kind or another, whether we choose that road or not. As we begin this journey toward discovering purpose, what direction would you say your life is headed right now? One day, the Apostle Paul was going down a road. Only then he was Saul, an ambitious Pharisee persecuting Christians as a way to earn favor with superiors. He was on his way to Damascus to arrest members of a group known as the Way, followers of Jesus. Along that road, Paul was stopped in his tracks. Listen to the story as it's told in Acts chapter 9. Now, as Saul was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." Paul was literally blinded and had to be told what to do. This experience changed the direction of his life, and there are a couple of things we can take away from this. For one, we are never so far down a road for God to redirect us. And another, that new direction comes with a willingness to be told what to do. Paul was led to Damascus, where a disciple named Ananias healed him. Paul knew immediately his purpose had changed. The cause he once labored to destroy, he now must champion. So, Paul went out immediately and began preaching and starting churches, right? Not so fast. Come with me to see what Paul did first. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he explained that after Damascus, he went into Arabia for 3 years. Arabia was a dry desert region east of the Dead Sea. It probably included Petra, and Paul may have spent some of that time in Petra. His experience with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but it changed the direction of his life. Now, Paul needed time to ponder, pray, and develop his relationship with Christ. He needed to be alone and listen for God's direction. Before talking with other people or consulting other sources, he consulted his number one source for guidance. What a barren area, isn't it? People have explained to me that there's actually nothing more beautiful than the desert after a rain shower. Suddenly, beautiful flowers and plants emerge you didn't know were there. It reveals hidden beauty. I believe that's why Paul came to this kind of place, to tap into hidden inner resources. Maybe you've had an experience like Paul on the Damascus Road, maybe not as dramatic, but God has stirred something in you, given you a passion for something important, education, hunger, making a career change. But that did not come with a roadmap. You don't know what that's going to look like to live out that passion. So first it begins with coming to a place like this, to learn to listen to God and understand that direction. Do you have an Arabia? Do you have a place where you can go and listen to the Holy Spirit? As you think about that, let's see where Paul went next. After Paul left Arabia, he went back to Damascus. He began preaching and debating with other Jews about his new faith in Christ. Paul was wrestling out what he believed, and because of that, people Paul once tried to impress now turned against him. They threatened his life, and so Paul came here to Jerusalem. I'm standing outside of the St. Mark's Church, believed to be the first church in Christianity. It's named for the author of Mark's Gospel, who's also called John Mark in other places in the New Testament. Today, they worship in the Syriac Orthodox tradition, which is the oldest liturgy in use in Christianity today. The church is built over the home of where John Mark lived with his mother, and the book of Acts says that the believers gathered here. When Paul came here, he met with the apostles in this place, but that first meeting was not very welcoming for Paul. We're here in the beautiful sanctuary of the St. Mark Church, which again is the home of John Mark and his mother Mary. Now, we don't know for sure that Paul came here, but because of the many references in the book of Acts that the leaders of the church met here, it just stands to reason that this is where Paul came. And let's understand why the apostles were reluctant to meet with Paul. They had only known him as a persecutor of the church. They would have never agreed to meet with him had it not been for a man named Barnabas. Barnabas was a Jew from Cyprus who came to believe in Christ while here in Jerusalem. In fact, the apostles renamed him. They called him Barnabas because he was the son of encouragement. He stood up in the gathering and defended Paul, and because of that, they trusted Paul. Do you have any Barnabases in your life? People who will stand up for you, people who will go to bat for you, who will defend you. Without Barnabas, Paul may have never discovered his purpose in life as an apostle. So, Paul has spent 3 years in Arabia, now 15 days here in Jerusalem. At last, he is finally ready to begin his work as a traveling apostle, right? Not so fast. Let's go and see where Paul would spend the next 14 years. We're here in Tarsus, located in southern central Turkey. This is Paul's hometown. We'll be back here in the next session and we'll learn more about Tarsus, but for now it's important to note that this is where Paul spent the next 14 years. Now, some scholars find discrepancy in that dating. They say that when Paul wrote to the Galatians and mentions coming to Tarsus for 14 years, it included his time in Arabia. But either way, it means he spent at least 11 years here. Now, think about that for a moment. Put it all together. Damascus, Arabia, Jerusalem, and now Tarsus. Paul spent 14 to 17 years after his conversion before beginning his work as an apostle. What do you think he did during those years? Why did Paul take so much time before he got to work? I'm here in Tarsus where the Cydnus River forms beautiful waterfalls and quiet reflection pools. I imagine the Apostle Paul spent a lot of time here in those years coming back to Tarsus. For a long time, I didn't understand that there were 14 years between Paul's conversion and his traveling as an apostle. I just thought he had his Damascus Road experience and immediately went out and began starting churches. But I find a powerful lesson about the years spent here, especially for a results-oriented, task-driven person like me. More important than the work I do for God is the work God does in me. My effectiveness depends on my connection to Christ. I believe that's what Paul learned during those 14 to 17 years here. He focused on knowing Christ, learning to listen, developing patience. This was not idle time. What happened here, those long years of preparation, would make a difference for the road ahead. Whatever Paul did while he was here, we know one thing for sure. He was ready the day his old friend Barnabas showed up and invited Paul to come join him at a very special church in a city called Antioch. Today, we linger here. Before we start doing something about our purpose in life, we think about the importance of not doing, taking time to contemplate, to listen. Having a sense of purpose in life begins with knowing who we are and whose we are, learning to hear that still small voice, and knowing when it is time to do something. As we close this session, take a moment to look right now at these images from Paul's world and think about our own life and what influenced us and the importance of taking time for discernment.
So, as we were reminded of the story of God calling Paul in the video, let's talk through that a little bit. What happens again? Paul, well, first of all, his name was Saul, right? And Saul was known as what? Persecutor of followers of Christ. He was quite well known, famous for that because he had persecuted so many followers. And did you hear it, how he referred to that? They were called followers of the way. This is the church, that wasn't, they weren't calling it the church yet, or, I'm a Christian. It was followers of the way. And he was a big persecutor of followers of the way, or followers of Jesus. And he was also present at the stoning of Stephen, right? Remember that? The martyr of the church. He was present for that, and just was very well known for the way that he treated people who followed Christ. And so he is on the road, and what happens next? This Saul, this big persecutor, what happens next? He what? Right. Why do you persecute me? Is it hard for you to kick against the goads? Adam Hamilton, in one of his books, he talks about that word goad. He says that shepherds at that time would use sticks, or they would call them goads. They would use these sticks or goads to prod oxen or cattle. And so in that way, God nudges us. God kind of pokes us from time to time and nudges us along. And so, Jesus says, why do you persecute me? Is it hard for you to kick against the goads? And so what happens next? He's blinded, right? He's blinded, and so he retreats. He goes to Damascus to try and figure this out, and he goes there to fast, and he goes there to pray. And 3 days later, a Christ follower comes by the name of Ananias, and he comes to visit Saul and to heal him. And with his sight restored, Saul will never see the world in the same way again. And Saul becomes Paul, and talk about a complete 180 in the way someone is living their life. I mean, it would have been just enough to say, wow, thank you for healing me, right? And I'm so sorry to doubt you, Jesus, and I'm so sorry that I've treated your followers this way, and I'll just go on my merry way. I mean, that would have been great by itself, but instead he does this complete his life is completely turned around to the point that he becomes, instead of the biggest persecutor of Christians, he becomes, this unbelievable leader and theologian and minister for Jesus Christ because of this new faith. Now, then we get to something that I think and a lot of people find very interesting. You would think, he has this experience, this amazing conversion experience, right? And in the video, we hear Rob say, and then he went right to work serving the Lord, right? Not so fast, he says. For somewhere in the range of 11 to 14 years, he wasn't yet in that role that we think of when we think of Paul. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? I mean, why do you think, what was he doing all that time? I mean, we know where he went, but why? Why 11 to 14 years before why didn't he just immediately start going out and preaching and teaching and writing and ministering and longest sabbatical ever? Yes, you have to be a student before you can teach. Yeah. And that really is, that's what it boils down to. I mean, you don't live the way that a person like Saul lived and persecute and hate, and in one day you have this conversion experience, and now you're fully equipped and fully educated and ready to, you might, now as human beings, like we said before the video, we might think, oh, I can handle this. But God wanted to make sure, because God knew that this was going to be something that we would still be talking about today. and if you're going to do it right. And so Paul took all this time for growth. And I mean, let's face it, he knew how to hate Christians, but he had to learn how to love like Jesus loved. He had to learn all of the teachings of Christ. He had to learn, all of the ways of Christ in order to, and he needed experiences. He had lots of experience. His resume was well padded with experience in terms of persecuting Christians, but he needed some life experience just to live as a follower of Christ before he was going to be a leader and preach and teach. And so I think that was a very important period for Paul, and I think that's a very important element in our faith journey. That when we have a purpose, there is that period of preparing for a purpose. That we're not just instantly made experts in something. That there is a time, even when you're talking about matters of the faith and a turned around life like that. It may feel turned around overnight, but it takes time when you're going to be in a role like Paul was being called to enter into. That he had to really prepare himself spiritually, emotionally. He needed a lot of time one-on-one with God in prayer and meditation to discern exactly, okay, great, I'm going to be a big, proponent for Jesus, but what does that mean specifically? And so he needed that time to be in conversation with God and to just listen and to allow God to shape his voice and to shape him as a leader. And so we see, this lengthy period that is focused on preparation and development and growth and contemplation and just listening, because you have to listen first in order to then figure out the next step in your direction and finding your purpose and finding your voice. Rob says it's important that we contemplate and listen before we do. So, discernment, period. Anybody know how old Paul was? How old was Paul? Young man, old man? Well, when he began his formal training to become an expert in the law and to begin his legal career of persecuting Christians, he was in his 20s. And so based on that, he was still a fairly young man. I mean, we're not talking, he wasn't the age of Abraham or Moses or anything like that. He was still a fairly young man like myself. But yeah, we do know that he was in his 20s when he started his formal training, and then, maybe 40s, late 30s, 40s, somewhere in there would be a reasonable, maybe 50, but still pretty young. So talking a little bit about Paul and this time of discernment and training. How does that relate to you in terms of either seeking a purpose in your life or a time when you were seeking your life's purpose? Do you feel that you still have that same purpose? Has your purpose changed a little over the years? Do you feel like it's kind of maybe wandered and come back, or how do you relate to what we've talked about so far with Paul and finding a purpose for your life? Are you still looking for your purpose? Do you have more than one purpose? Getting late in the game, you say. Yeah. Right. But do you feel like you have a purpose? I mean, have you ever felt that feeling that you feel like you know what your purpose in life is? Or Yeah, you know your purpose when you're working, and that's a good point too. A lot of people define their purpose through their work, and for them, their job is their purpose. You know, depending on what their job is, and for some people, their job can be a calling. I mean, I've heard a lot of teachers tell me, you know, it was a calling, just like you're called to the pulpit. I was called to be a teacher. I feel like that was my calling, and in some cases, even that ties in with their faith. They felt like God was calling them to be a teacher who happens to be a Christian. You know, that they brought that perspective, in just not that they're preaching in the classroom, but just in the way that they treat people in that setting. And I've heard people in other careers tell me the same thing, in a variety of careers, you know. I'm sorry, let me bring this to you because I'll get yelled at if I don't. I'm sorry, no, please talk. That's the yellow one. But someone will email me tomorrow and they'll say, I can't hear anything anybody's saying.
Okay. My purpose also now is to be a role model for
Yes.
our kids and for our grandkids.
Yeah. Role model for your kids and grandkids. Yeah. And can't your life purpose change over the course of your life? Can it not? Sometimes it needs tweaking, sometimes it can change altogether, and you can have a purpose that you feel has been fulfilled, and now you feel you have a different calling or purpose, yeah. Oh, I saw redirected. I like it. I saw a hand go up. There we go.
I was just going to add on to what Don was saying, that I think sometimes the experiences that prepare us for our purpose, like being a role model or whatever, are things we never even asked for or wanted, the things that happen to us in our lives.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're very painful things, but they prepare us to be able to do what we're meant to do.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that I think, well, almost 39 years of marriage, August, our purposes have merged, and I think in the beginning it was a responsibility and a duty, and now it's kind of a privilege or a pleasure. You know, it's merged and different, and if I don't know my purpose, Sandy will tell me, hey, we're feeding the homeless, whatever
Right.
it is, and I go, yeah, we're doing it, but I think time together has merged that, and I don't know that we see it as I got to go to church and do this thing, or, you know, now it's more of a desire to do it.
Yeah.
I think we've learned that it actually, in some small step, helps move things forward.
That's good. I really love that part that we were just talking about in terms of the preparation time, because I just think that is such good information for all of us, that, you know, when we feel that we are being called or led to a purpose, or to change a purpose, that it doesn't have to just, we put so much pressure on ourselves, it has to happen right away, and that we need to allow ourselves that time to really pray and discern, and before we shift that focus and get into that new purpose, that that's okay, you know, that's okay to have that time for development and growth. You know, when we feel something that powerful, then we have to give it the time it needs when we're finding that purpose or changing to a different purpose. Want to get into the next segment real quick. We're going to watch that, but one of the last thing that I just want to lift up to you that I really appreciated Rob saying was, he was talking about the role of Barnabas and how important that role of Barnabas was in Paul's life. And he said, do you have any Barnabases in your life? People who will stand up for you, who will go to bat for you, because that's important too when we're talking about a purpose in life, and, you know, and that feeling that we're not in this alone, or that we have to figure it all out by ourselves, or that we just, you know, it's between us and praying to God. But to have an actual Barnabas in our life, someone who is going to bat for us, who is there to stand up for us, to support us, to be a sounding board, those people can be so crucial in our lives when we're trying to figure things out, and trying to you know, really focus that on that purpose in life. So like as I talk about that, is anyone picturing someone in your life like, oh, I have my Barnabas, I know who that is? Anybody, yeah, think of someone? I hope you do, and if you don't, I hope you will look for the Barnabas in your life, because they are priceless. So, all right, we're gonna go ahead and watch that second video now, Ryan.
How can I discern God's plans for me?
How should I respond when confronted with obstacles?
By studying the life of the Apostle Paul, we'll learn what it means to be created for a purpose, to be equipped to live a life of significance, despite the adversity and detours we encounter along the way.
In this session, we're taking stock of our lives. Have you ever thought how your life is like a mosaic with many pieces making up the design? You are the combination of your unique features, background, influences, skills, and abilities, everything that goes into making up the pattern of your life. In other words, you're a work of art. We're back here in Tarsus, the hometown of the Apostle Paul. We're in an area of the city where there is an ancient well dedicated to Paul. Like any city in any part of the world in any time in history, Tarsus had its own cultural, political, religious, and geographic realities that shaped the people who lived here. So let's think about what formed the Apostle Paul in this place. Paul referred to Tarsus as no ordinary city, which means it was a thriving metropolis. In Paul's day, it probably had a population of 250,000 people. It was founded by the Hittites over 4,000 years ago. The book of Genesis traces the lineage of the Hittites back to Noah. Tarsians were known as hard-working people. They were also known for the tents they made. That's a trade Paul would have learned growing up here. Tarsus was also visited by Alexander the Great, who nearly died swimming in the Cydnus River. His visit brought Hellenism, the influence of Greek culture, language, and philosophy. Paul would have grown up listening to the philosophers in the street, terrific orators, persuading people of their philosophy. I'm at Cleopatra's Gate. In Paul's day, this was the gateway of the city. It gets its name because Tarsus is the place where Mark Antony first met Cleopatra. It was a significant Roman city, and it makes this a good place to think about the Tarsus where Paul grew up. It reflects the two worlds Paul lived in. We see that in his names. He was named for the first king of Israel, Saul. It reflects his Hebrew identity. But he was also named Paul, reflecting his non-Jewish identity. Paul inherited a Roman citizenship from his father, a very valuable possession. It meant that he could not be arrested without a fair trial. If he didn't like the outcome, he could appeal to a higher authority. He could also hold office and vote in Roman affairs anywhere in the empire. Tarsus was also granted free city status by Rome. That meant that the people did not have to pay taxes. So the citizens here used that money that would have gone to Rome and put it into education. It is said that Tarsus rivaled Alexandria and Athens as a great university city. Paul would have grown up in a culture that valued education. And because of that, we go to our next stop. I'm here in Jerusalem at the Tower of David Museum. Below me are some of the ruins from the original city of David. When Paul was a boy, he moved here to live with his married sister and her family. He came to study under one of the most respected leaders in Israel, a man named Gamaliel. We get a glimpse into Gamaliel's character from a story in Acts chapter 5. The ruling religious council was meeting to decide what to do about the church. Gamaliel spoke up. He said, if this is merely a human effort, it will take care of itself. But if God is in it, they may be resisting God. His voice of wisdom won out. How important do you think his influence was on Paul? Do you have any mentors and teachers who influenced your life? If so, how did they influence you? As we think about important influences, let's go now to another location here in Jerusalem. I'm standing outside the Lion's Gate. Somewhere close to here is where the first Christian martyr named Stephen was stoned to death. The book of Acts says that the people laid their cloaks at the feet of Saul, which means he oversaw the execution. Saul, who of course became Paul, found that persecuting Christians was a great way to advance his career. Now, how influential do you think this place was on his life? He would forever remember that he participated in the death of an innocent man, yet he would find forgiveness through Jesus Christ. And God would use Paul to tell other people about that forgiveness. Certainly what happened here impacted Paul's ability and desire to tell others about the grace of Jesus Christ. Knowing how much God had forgiven him, he was able to speak with conviction about God's willingness to forgive others. Do you have a place like this? A place that represents your regrets and your failure? Have you ever done anything that you feel disqualifies you from being used by God? How would God look at those things? How might God want to use your failure? Before we leave here, there's one more thing to think about. This place doesn't just stand for Paul's failure, it also represents his ambition. On the road to Damascus, God changed the direction of Paul's life, but God did not change everything about Paul. Paul continued to remain ambitious and driven, only now he was ambitious for sharing the gospel of Christ. Sometimes I believe people are reluctant to make themselves available to God because they believe it means changing everything about their lives. But what if that's not true? What if God doesn't want to change everything about you, just redirect some things? As you think about that, let's go to one last stop for this session. Behind me is the ancient Greek city of Corinth, located on the Peloponnesus Peninsula, about 50 miles west of Athens. We'll come back here in session 5 and learn more about Corinth. For now, what's important to note is on Paul's second missionary journey, he started a church here. He would later write to them and talk about the way we are all pots of clay with treasures inside, treasures that give us the power to make Jesus visible. And he would write and talk about spiritual gifts. Listen to his words in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one it is the same God at work. Now to each one of the manifestation the Spirit is given for the common good. To one there is given through the Spirit a message of wisdom, to another a message of knowledge by means of the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by that one Spirit, to another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and to still another the interpretation of tongues. All of these are the work of the one and same Spirit, and He distributes them to each one just as He determines. So we each are given gifts for building up the church. Different gifts, same Spirit. You're probably aware of your unique God-given talents and abilities, but did you know that you have special spiritual gifts? What are the gifts in your life that can honor God? As we close this session now and you get ready to discuss with others, let me offer a few questions to you. What is your Tarsus? What is the place that shaped and formed your life? What is your Jerusalem? What are those experiences, good and bad, that God can use? And what is your Corinth? What are your unique spiritual gifts? As you think about those, take a look at images from this session.
So I did just a quick double check, and he was actually, it was in his 40s. He was called, the story that we read, we don't know for sure, but the scholars, based on things that they do know, say he was probably around 30 when he was called by God, but by the time he began his ministry, he was into his 40s. Let's start with those last couple of questions that Rob has at the end of the video. What is your Tarsus? What is that place that shaped and formed your life? The Christian home you were raised in. Okay. Yeah. Anybody else have anything different that your Tarsus? Yes.
I lived overseas for about five and a half years as a kid, and I think the experience of being in a different culture and being in a very diverse population has been very important in my development.
Okay, interesting. Thought you were going to say the campus at Duke.
Well, that too, but that's a different story.
Yeah. What is your Jerusalem? What experiences, good and bad, that are in your life that you feel God has been able to use?
That's the Duke campus.
There you go. Anybody else? What can think of what is your Jerusalem, your experiences, both good and bad, that God can use? It's career changes. Yeah.
I spent 35 years teaching, but the best part of it was preparing me to go to Africa to teach teachers there, many of whom only had gone through high school, and they only knew how to teach by rote. And we all know that there are far better ways than just talking.
How about your Corinth, your unique spiritual gifts? What is your Corinth? What is your spiritual gift? I do too. Yeah. Depending on what? Depending on what they can change. What's needed. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We'll have more time next week for discussion. There will be more questions for next week. This was just intended to kind of get us thinking in terms of exploring our purpose and looking at Paul and to really kind of contemplate that. But as we close out, I want to share this one thing with you, especially if you are thinking about your life's purpose, or if you're reevaluating your life's purpose, or if you feel like maybe you've gotten off the path. In the Leader Guide, Rob shares this a couple of great analogies, and the first leads him into the second. And the first one is, he talks about his family and how competitive they are. And he talks about this one year that a bunch of them had been watching the Iron Chef, and so they decided they were going to have their own Iron Chef competition. They divided into two teams, and he has a family member who is a pastor, and their church was nearby, her church was nearby that she pastored. So they went down to the kitchen of the church, and they divided into two teams, and then they took turns. Each team would take turns picking ingredients that they would then make into a meal. And so they quickly realized that they could play both offense and defense, because one team would pick the tomato sauce, and after the other team had just chosen the pasta noodles, the other team would pick the tomatoes. And then when one team picked the taco meat, the other team snatched up the tortillas. And so, to kind of prevent them from making a traditional Mexican dish. And so they went back and forth on this, and then they had to make something that, was edible, because that was also going to be their dinner, but they also wanted it to be good, and they wanted to win the competition. And so at the end, he says, I'm still nursing a grudge that my team's veggie enchiladas lost out to the other team's taco spaghetti. But he takes that illustration and he says, he applies it to how many people go about finding their life's purpose. He says that we tend to go about finding our life's purpose in a very different way. We follow a recipe. So, in other words, we say, I want to be CEO of a company, or an attorney, or a politician, and then we gather the necessary ingredients to get there. But he says it doesn't always work that way, especially if you're discerning where God is leading you. Sometimes you take the ingredients that you have, and God makes something very unique out of it. And he said, I'll give you an example. He said, I had a young man that was a member of my church. He said, graduated from a small liberal arts college with a degree in economics. Took an executive position with a pharmaceutical company. The only problem with that was, despite having a lucrative career, that his passion wasn't in it. He said he didn't get joy from that. He had a great career path, was going to make a lot of money, but he just had no passion. He said that he sat down with him one day and talked with him about, where is your passion? And he said he was almost embarrassed to say it, because he could just feel that everyone he would tell would just laugh. But he said, I was a college athlete, and he said, I love basketball, and I just want to be around basketball. I want to coach. I want to, whatever I can do, I want to be involved in, but that's where my passion is. And he said, everybody thinks I'm crazy because I've got this guaranteed career. And so anyway, he, after a couple of talks with him, he one day went to Butler University. Have you ever heard Butler University in Indianapolis? He goes to Butler University and pitched himself to the basketball coaching staff there. I mean, with no coaching experience, and and so they offered him an unpaid position to review game films. Right? What do you think he did? He went and quit that job, that high-paying job. He quit and had saved enough, what he hoped would be enough money to get him by, and took the unpaid position. 1 year later, Butler University promoted him to a full-time assistant coach, And 6 years later, he became the head coach of Butler University's men's basketball team and took Butler to 2 consecutive national championship games. You all remember the one in 2010 when Duke played Butler and they got that shot off at the buzzer and it almost went in. Fortunately, it didn't. But that coach was Brad Stevens that year, and that's who he's talking about. Brad Stevens, and that would have been a great story if it had ended there. Brad Stevens later, a few years later, went on to become the head coach of my Boston Celtics, and is currently not the coach of the Boston Celtics. Rather, he is the president of basketball operations for the Boston Celtics. I mean, that's just amazing. But he, instead of just saying, I want to be the head coach of the Boston Celtics, now how do I get there? He took the ingredients that he had. And so that's what Rob talks about, is sometimes we can't just follow a recipe. We take our strengths, our gifts, and we allow God to use those gifts and direct us in a path that maybe is uncharted or is quite unique. And so we can find our life's purpose using that method as well. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up for this week. Thank you all for being here, and we will pick this up next week. But we talked about the taking stock was that second chapter. And so we find that preparation is important. Just a quick review. Preparation is important, that time of preparing and focusing, and then taking stock, looking at those gifts, those strengths that we have, and figuring out, okay, now what direction do I feel God leading me? And then taking that goad, taking that nudge by God to go in that direction. So, and then we'll see where we go next week. See where Paul went next week. So let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this gathering, Lord. We thank you for this study and for this time together in the season of Lent as we look within our own lives to figure out how we could be more like the people you've called us to be, Lord, whether that is changing our life's purpose or whether it is just getting our life's purpose back on track. We pray that this will be a very special time for us, God, to listen to your voice, to explore our many gifts that you have given us, and to find out how we can best use them to your glory. Lord, thank you for blessing us tonight with your presence as always, and keep us safe. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Sorry we went a little over, but y'all have a great rest of your night, a great weekend.